Another name for Florida State has been added to the coaching staff, and another one with Nebraska ties. Go figure. It's on the defensive side of the ball. Spoiler alert, Florida State names former Nebraska and NFL coach Evan Cooper. He spent time with the Carolina Panthers as their new safeties coach, and joining me to talk about that is the publisher of Husker Online, one of the great sites on the On3 network. He's Sean Callahan. Sean, appreciate the time. Evan Cooper has been with Matt Rule. I'm looking at the byline and the bio that Florida State released. I'm seeing Baylor. I'm seeing the Carolina Panthers and Nebraska. This was somebody that was very close to Matt Rule for years. Tell me a little bit about Florida State's newest coach.
Yeah, Evan Cooper, to kind of put it into perspective, when Matt Rule took the Nebraska job, there were two people that got off the plane with him first in Lincoln, the strength coach Corey Campbell and Evan Cooper. So in terms of just the Matt Rule hierarchy, I mean, he was as big as it got, and he was Matt Rule's main recruiting evaluator. And even at Carolina, I think he had a big voice in draft decisions and things that they did. But going back to Baylor, I mean, he was kind of one of the main masterminds of what they did in recruiting, and they produced a lot of NFL players with his evaluations. So, and it's unorthodox. I mean, they don't just go for the easy, low-hanging fruit. I mean, Evan Cooper prides himself in identifying traits in, say, a low 3-star guy. Then all of a sudden, when other people see what he's seeing, that player gets ranked higher. So he's very good at least identifying traits early. I mean, Ja'Cory Barney, who's at Nebraska, set a freshman record, and they got him out of Miami. And, Nebraska took 5 Miami players last year, and Evan Cooper played a huge role in that. And all 5 of those true freshmen that Nebraska added from Miami are good players. I mean, they all contributed for the most part in some portion as true freshmen.
It's interesting to me, Sean, because this is somebody who's been with Matt Rule every step of the way. And Tony White, that's not exactly the same timeline for his coaching history, because he came from Syracuse over to Nebraska. So this signals something here. You got obviously pot roast Terrence Knighton's been announced this week by Florida State. Evan Cooper now. Seems like Tony White was well liked. Is that fair to say? Because now at minimum, 2 on-field assistants follow Tony White, in addition to maybe some support staffers as well.
Yeah, and I would imagine the autonomy. I mean, Matt Rule's a defensive-minded guy and had a big voice in things too, I think. And so going to Florida State for Tony White, I think he'll have full autonomy. And I don't know how much Mike Norvell gets involved in the defensive side of the football, but I think for Tony, he sees it as an opportunity. Him and Matt Rule, the only connection they had before Nebraska is they were essentially 2 passing ships in the night at UCLA. Matt Rule, in one of his very first coaching jobs as a low level coach, was at UCLA when Tony White was finishing as a player. So that was the only real small connection that they had. But then years later, it circled back around to bring him to Nebraska. And, his very first game, and you go back to Minnesota, the Minnesota game in 2023, they shut down the run so much in that opener at Minnesota. They ended up losing 13-10. But PJ Fleck had to throw the football more times than he's ever had to throw in a game. And your viewers probably aren't as familiar, but Minnesota likes to only throw like 20, 25 times a game. And they threw like 45 times or some, obscure number because they couldn't run. So there's a lot of critics of the 3-3-5. But Tony White's very versatile in what they do. And you look at what it did this year for Nebraska and the trouble that it gave opponents. Colorado had its worst offensive game, arguably, of the year. They were down 28-0 to Nebraska at halftime. Completely disrupted Shedeur Sanders, limited Travis Hunter to his most ordinary game, maybe of the season, that he put up. And Ohio State had its worst offensive game. Kyle Monangai, the other All Big Ten running back, they held him under 100 yards for Rutgers this year in a game. And then they held Iowa's running back, Caden Johnson, to his worst game of the year. So at its peak, the Tony White defense was really good, and these guys had a lot of success working with Tony White. Now, there were some outlier games, though, like UCLA this year, like the Indiana game, and I think you can make that with any team that's 6-6. You're going to have this discussion, but at the peak of Tony White's system, when it was really rolling, it shut down some of the best offenses this year in college football.
The question I'd have now about Evan Cooper, and then also I guess we could extend that out to Knighton, because we haven't spoken with you since Florida State announced that Terrence Knighton was going to be its new defensive line coach. Just in terms of presence, like I'm seeing a through line here for these new additions in the recruiting world, evaluation world, and that's something that is going to perk up Florida State fans, because Florida State has been dipping into the portal with such regularity. It's an indictment on the high school recruiting. These kids aren't graduating up the ranks and able to play, so they need to keep going into the portal. So I'll ask you, though, about their presence. I mean, you've interviewed these gentlemen, Evan Cooper and Terrence Knighton. I know that Evan Cooper did resign from Nebraska over the summer, so he's had a bit of time away from college football, but he re-enters. Just anything about their presence, what Florida State fans can expect to hear from them, and then obviously see from them as we get great access to practice footage.
Yeah, Terrence Knighton is a big personality. Players love him. I think when he was with the Denver Broncos, he was voted the media's favorite player to talk to and deal with. So your fan base is going to love Terrence Knighton and what he brings. He developed a pretty good recruiting reputation recently in Houston. He actually had been getting good players. So I don't know if that jives with where Florida State will recruit, but he got good in there. But Evan Cooper is from Miami. He's a younger guy. He's got a lot of experience for a guy his age, and he's really grown. And I think at one point people thought, oh, this guy could be a coordinator. He's on track to be a coordinator. He's moving up the ranks fast. But yeah, he's a no nonsense player, Evan Cooper, with players. I've seen him. A player made one of those philosophical, I'm not getting a lot of playing time tweets, and he responded to the guy on Twitter. I mean, he's not afraid to speak up to some of these kids, and he's young enough too that I think he speaks to the players, and the players really liked Evan Cooper. He was well respected by the players, and obviously his recruiting evaluations, he's a Miami native originally, so I would imagine he is going to have a big say in the South Florida and really the state of Florida recruiting, with what Florida State does, and especially on defense. I mean, he's going to have a big say because he's a junkie. He will tell you that he watches recruiting film on his own time at all times. When he was basically fired by the Panthers, there was about a 10-day period where they knew they were coming to Nebraska potentially. He was watching recruits film and making offers to guys, just saying, hey, you don't know me, but I do plan to offer you if we get this Nebraska job. I mean, he's just that dialed in. Knowing Evan Cooper, he is probably watching film right now of transfer portal players and high school targets at this very, very second, trying to give Tony White some names to help build that defense with.
Will be a fascinating way to set the chessboard for Florida State, with Evan Cooper now as the safeties coach, Patrick Surtain at present as Florida State's defensive backs coach. I know his name has been mentioned for maybe a head coaching position or another position elsewhere, but Surtain has connections to American Heritage. Evan Cooper has connections to American Heritage. Also, Westminster Academy down in South Florida, going to be very, very fascinating. Sean, thank you so much for the insights. I know we've done a lot of these conversations. At some point, I suppose if Florida State sends some coaches and Matt Rule poaches some coaches from Florida State, we will return the favor, but you're a fountain of knowledge. We really appreciate it.
Hey, we're the official Florida State affiliate here right now in Lincoln, Nebraska. So anytime, appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. All right, everybody, hit the like button underneath the video. Subscribe to the channel. It's absolutely free. And if you want more information and context on what it was like for Tony White and Terrence Knighton and others at Nebraska, like Evan Cooper, head over to Husker Online on the On3 Network.